Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome back to BTM, your basketball time machine, the show with former NBA players about former NBA players. Before I'm going to introduce today's guest, just a little reminder, if you want to hear more podcasts like this one, just make sure you hit that subscribe button and also click on the notifications button so you always get notified once we upload a new video. All right, today's guest played in the NBA from 1990 until 1997. Steve Scheffler, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Sean. Pleasure to be here.
Steve, I was wondering, did you always want to become a basketball player as a child?
I did. Matter of fact, when I was a little kid, my friend was Mike Bond. I remember sleeping over at his house and asked him what he wanted to be when he was older. And for me, it was basketball, baseball, or football. If you're really weird, it was back in the 70s, you wanted to be soccer. And he wanted to be like some type of scientist. And I was like, no, Mike, what do you really want to be? I couldn't get my head. It's like, well, I guess if you're non-athletic, maybe you want to be a policeman, fireman, but the whole mindset was being a professional athlete.
Okay, so when did you start paying attention to NBA basketball?
This is a bad answer. I never really did pay attention to NBA basketball. I liked the Bird Magic matchups. Those were fun. I liked, being from Michigan, Detroit, when they had their good runs. That was fun. And when I was in college, I started to pay attention, like, hey, who's making it to the NBA and what are they doing? But I never really watched NBA basketball growing up.
Wow, okay. That's surprising, actually.
I knew about it. I have a brother that's 13 years older than I am.
Also played in the NBA?
He played 1 year. He played mainly overseas, and that's a whole different story. But when he's a 30-year-old, he became a rookie in the NBA. So, and then he went back overseas. He still lives in Switzerland, Lugano, Switzerland. So.
Okay, but was he still a player that you idolized?
It was my brother. I wanted to outdo him.
All right, makes sense.
I'm the little brother, and everybody's talking all this about Tom, and I'm like, well, whatever he does, I want to outdo him.
Do you remember, did your brother have a trading card or a poster of himself?
I don't know if he is. My brother is Tom Scheffler. If you look him up on the internet, you can find stuff about him. I think he had, he played at Portland Trailblazers. He was when Clyde Drexler was their rookie.
Yes,
They're both
in 83.
rookies together. Yes, see, you know your NBA history.
Of course, man.
And, that was his one thing. The story behind that was he had a contract in France. He was a successful player in France. In a lot of ways, he was a better basketball player than I was. He worked harder. He had more of a jumping body, more athletic body than I did. I was more of a football build between the two of us. But when he got into college, he would work hard, but he'd party hard.
Oh,
and eventually he got married overseas, and she kind of straightened him out. And he was just in a summer league with Portland because he's like, okay, yeah, this is a great way to stay in shape. And they're like, hey, we'd like to offer you a contract. And he's well, I really appreciate that, but I already have a contract over in France.
Wow.
It's already signed. And they're like, well, we don't usually give rookies guaranteed contracts, but they made an exception for him. So he got to play a year in the league, and we like to trade stories about that. So.
Well, that's crazy.
Yeah,
okay.
Yes.
But your brother wasn't drafted, right?
I think he was like the 6th round by the Indiana Pacers or something. He played, here's another kind of crazy story, is one of my college roommates, Steve Daniels, was watching when my brother was a senior, and Joe Barry Carroll came in as a freshman then. So he always used to hate when my brother was in because Joe Barry was out. And he is like, we got another Scheffler at Purdue basketball? What a loser. Can't take this anymore. But we still ended up being friends. And, my freshman year, he was very justified in that estimation. So, but it worked out all right.
You were drafted in 1990 by the Charlotte Hornets with the 39th pick. How intense was that day for you? Do you remember how it felt or what it felt like?
I remember, No, it wasn't that intense because I was basically sitting with my parents in our house just watching the TV. You know, it wasn't like I was in a suit or whatever or anything like that. So it was a big deal, but it wasn't that big a deal because it's like, okay, great, you're drafted. You're not in the NBA yet. You're not doing anything. The one thing that kind of hit me was I was at Charlotte, and Ron Grinker was my agent. He was a really good agent, and he prepared us really well, and he helped guys like me that were low on the totem pole actually make teams. But we had like 14 guaranteed contracts, and I was like going, this isn't good. And fortunately, he had me stick for a guaranteed before I'd come in there. And I remember when the last guys were cut, and we're, I think, in Virginia, and I was in an NBA warm-up going, I think I'm actually going to be on the team. And then I remember going through warm-ups, looking down at my uniform going, you know, this was for like the first game going, I'm actually in the NBA. I felt I was running the biggest con, but I'm like, hey, by hook or by crook, you made it in here, so congratulations. You got this off the bucket list.
Yeah, I mean, you were lucky in terms of, I mean, you could have landed on definitely landed on a worse team. I mean, the Hornets were a brand new franchise back then, and they had a really talented roster. I mean, Del Curry was there, Rex Chapman was great, Kendall Gill was great. Yeah, I would like to know, what was the chemistry like being on a really new franchise?
Well, I got some really good advice from my agent. He said, you know, I came from a structure with Purdue basketball, Gene Katie, you know, really strict, really hard-nosed, really intense. And I remember one player that was a quote-unquote star coming into the locker room, and we're still an expansion team, and he was singing, dun, 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 and the circus continues when we got blown out by 20. And I was just like going, boy, my agent said there's nothing professional about professional basketball, and it's an entertainment business. He said those two rules will hold true, and everything will make sense off of that. And I was like, he was right. And then another time, I remember coming in there when Del Curry, right? He's walking around, and I don't know if he's joking or he gives everybody a high five, going, they couldn't get rid of me, they couldn't get rid of me, because they're trying to trade him. And they ended up getting rid of Kendall Gill, and they got rid of Rex Chapman eventually, right? But they ended up holding on to Del Curry for all those years after I left. And I was just like, wow, that was crazy. But the Charlotte environment then was really fun and intense. The city had really gotten behind the team because I think the right to buy some seats, not the actual seats, just the right to buy them, went for $100,000 back in the day.
Wow.
And it was like, wow, this is crazy. And they would be cheering even when we'd be down 20. So it was like, wow, this is cool.
Pretty interesting. I actually don't know if that's a good or a bad thing.
It was a good situation, but a bad situation, because now you're learning a lot of bad habits. You know, because you're not learning how to win and be successful in the NBA. I learned that kind of my second year, even though it was just preseason in Boston, but they were all about, we're winning a championship, right? In Charlotte at that time, it was more like the circus. I mean, one of the good things I learned was I was sitting there with Kelly Tripucka, and, you know, they called for boarding. And I got up to board the plane, and he said, just sit down for a second. And I was like, what? He's like, you're going to be in that plane for the next couple hours, right? And this is before they'd have the big charter planes. I think L.A., Lakers, and Detroit were the only two that had their own plane, and that was a big deal. So you'd have to get first flight out, which was his own nightmare. But anyways, he's like, just sit here. He's like, your seat's going to be there. Enjoy this concourse, and we can walk in last minute and just sit down. And he was right. So I was like, all right, cool. But outside, like, when you actually get to the basketball part, it's like, no, it was Mickey Mouse Circus there.
All right, crazy.
But I was fortunate to be on a team and get in the league. I was really fortunate for that.
Steve, you mentioned earlier that you started watching NBA basketball with the rivalries between the Celtics and the Lakers, so Matt Johnson versus Larry Bird. And you also worked out for the Celtics in the preseason. I'm actually curious about, do you have any funny Larry Bird story you want to share with us?
Yeah. See, now this is where you learn something about how to win. Because one, we went to, I was preseason with Boston. I ended up getting cut, but I'm like, all right, well, at least I've got good Larry Bird stories. But we were in Albany, New York. Something got messed up, so everybody was late. And we're all just sitting around there. So Larry goes, and the equipment manager's running around, so he opens up the bag, and he passes out everybody's socks and jocks. You know, and then he sits down and he looks at Rick Fox, who was a rookie then. He said, Rook, next time that's your job. And we just went out and started warming up. Matter of fact, it was a culture there where if you didn't win the championship, it was considered a failure. So there'd be times when the coaches would be late for practice, and practice would start without them. And I remember, like, Ed Pickney then went and he broke his shoelace, and we're doing the drills where you warm up, where you do this karaoke side to side, or I forget what that's called, you know, the back pedals, all that good stuff. He got out of line, fixed his shoe. Coaches are still not there, then got on the side, ran and made up with the team, and then we went on to practice. And then Larry Bird would say some sarcastic stuff to the coaches when they'd come in late. But the funny story with Larry, or the interesting story with Larry, is I was able to play him one-on-one. And we're both about the same height. Unfortunately, he was coming up off of a back surgery, so I can say I dominated him one-on-one. Now, there are a few caveats. I'm in no means saying I'm a better basketball player, but I was able to win. And the main thing was you'd play 2 dribbles behind the NBA three-point line, and he didn't have lateral movement then, so you could just drive around him and shoot layups. And even if you'd hit a layup, you'd kind of say, like, just, you know, like, hey, that's a cheap shot. That didn't count as a basketball move. So eventually we got into a game where we played one-on-one behind the NBA three-point line, no dribbles. And you're like, how tough could this be? Well, after the first couple of shots for me, I was like, I'm tired of chasing the ball, because Larry wasn't going to be chasing any balls, and my ball, you know, if I hit backboard, I was lucky. But to guard him, you know, you'd think you're the same height. How hard can this be? He can't dribble. Well, he could fade back, and he'd have the ball behind his head in such a way that you couldn't really block it. And if you tried to get up to block him, just face guard him, he could just pivot around the side and still get an accurate shot. And he wouldn't make, like, every shot, but he hit a really high percentage, and it'd just be like, well, this is a different, you know, class of basketball. But Larry was funny also. I remember he was playing, and Anderson Hunt from UNLV was supposed to be guarding him for some reason, and he would trash talk even in practice. Like, he would get the ball, and he'd be a wide open three. Anderson got caught underneath, and he'd start whistling like a dog. Come here, and he'd motion with his fingers. And Anderson would take off and have to run out at him. He'd shoot the ball, he'd start backpedaling, and he'd just start shaking his head. Too short, too short. You know, and you'd think, well, he's a big jerk. No, he's not. He just likes to talk that trash. You know, on a personal level, he is a whole, you know, he's pretty inspirational on here's how you have to win, and we're all about winning. And if you need a favor or needed help, he was there. But on the court, he could be brutal.
Oh, man, Larry was unbelievable. But you know what? If I was in your shoes and I would have beaten Larry Bird, even if he was in a wheelchair or something, man, it still counts. It just has to count.
I guess it still counts with a caveat, yes.
Absolutely. Talking about the Charlotte Hornets again, one of my favorite players from back in the days was one of your teammates, Muggsy Bogues, Tyrone Bogues.
Yes.
How impressed were you seeing a 5'3" guy actually playing that good?
Okay, here's what was impressive about Muggsy, and it was funny also, was we're playing the 76ers, and they put a full court press on us. You know, we're bad at Charlotte, so we're like, well, maybe they can't handle the press. I have no idea what they're thinking. Coach Little called a timeout, and here was our press breaker. He said, everybody run down the court except for Muggsy. Throw the ball to Muggsy, and then the guy inbounding the pass, run down the court. Muggsy, you break the press. So Muggsy would go He would go and catch, because nobody could really deny him from catching the ball inbound, so he'd catch the ball. And he's looking at 2 NBA guards, right? With 2 backup forwards behind him. And he would, zigzag like a running back coming through a wide open gap. And he'd break both of their ankles. And the forwards, once they saw that, would just be like, we got to get into immediate retreat, because if they couldn't touch him, there's no way we can. And he would almost catch up to them, and then be passing the ball to 4 open guys. And I think they ran it twice in a row, and that's the only time I ever saw anyone try to press Muggsy, because he was that quick and that explosive. The one problem, though, is you see Muggsy, and he's part of that motivational speech that I kind of resent hearing to little kids going, if you work hard enough, you can do anything you want to do. And I always want to say to them, then why are you a retired athlete, right? Why aren't you still doing it? Because you get old. Hard work exponentially increases your probability of success. But if you're short, slow, and non-athletic, you will go from 0.0001 to 0.0002. Highly unlikely that it's ever going to happen to you, that you're actually going to have success. But with Muggsy, you say he was short. He was an incredible. His speed, his quickness, his stockiness was awesome. I mean, he could deny much taller players in the post by just being strong and getting that center of gravity.
Yeah, so I remember Steve Smith actually said that he changed his position from point guard to shooting guard because he hated to bring the ball up against Muggsy Bogues because he was so quick.
Yeah. Shoot, I'd hate to bring it up against any point guard, but yeah, Muggsy, he was dangerous to deal with.
So in your rookie season, you played 39 games, but you didn't receive that much playing time. So my question would be, how difficult is it to motivate yourself, giving 110% every practice, when you know that the reward, getting actual minutes in the game, is always so slim?
Because you're getting paid. You're in the NBA. This is your dream. You got your dream, and guess what? You are at the end of the bench. Matter of fact, here's how bad it was. When you're a rookie, you go and sit next to the assistant coach, right? And the assistant coach was like, don't sit next to me. I need to talk to the main players, right? He didn't say it quite in those words. It was Tom Lasaki. But he said that to a degree, right? You got to go sit at the end of the bench. So then as a rookie, you try to find a spot at the end of the bench, and all the veterans are like, no, get out of here, get out of here, get out of here. So I end up next to the assistant coach again going, nobody will give up their seat. Nobody wants to sit next to you, basically. I'm stuck here. I'm sorry. So you're always on that edge of, I remember when I was at Seattle, and most of my years there, I'd always be on a cut contract. And I would be arguing with Coach Carl about politics. And he'd be, Scheffler, it was preseason even. He's like, Scheffler, I can just go and cut you right now, and you're fired? I was like, yeah, coach, because around Christmas you got guaranteed for the rest of the year, so that was always a big deal. And I said, yeah, coach, but you're still wrong. And he laughed at that or whatever. So, but, just that pressure of you are hanging on by your fingernails. So getting motivated is really easy.
Okay, I see. You just mentioned that you played for the Seattle Supersonics. That was in 1992. That was a really, really interesting team because not only did you have the young guns like Sean Kemp and Gary Payton, but also some really good vets in Eddie Johnson and Ricky Pierce, for example. Did you know that you were actually playing for a really, really good team back then? No,
I didn't. I didn't appreciate because my first year there, we went to the Western Conference. But before that, they kind of had a fluke when they made it to the playoffs. And they didn't even fill up the arena. That was one of the things that bothered the players for their first round against Golden State for one of the games. So it was still a young, struggling team. Sean was hoping to make the All-Star team, And Gary was kind of, well, maybe we'll get him in on a whim or something like that, but he wasn't making it. So, and like, all right, you could say Eddie, he's old, Ricky, he's old. Derek McKee was really good, but people didn't really appreciate what he could do yet. So, I mean, we got on a hot run, but we almost got knocked out of the playoffs. I think it was that year in the first round. It was against Utah. It was Game 5 at home, and they got us down like 20 points. It was 15 or 20 points. You can look it up if you want. And I remember we went into the locker room, and Eddie Johnson, he was the one guy that could talk to Gary. And I remember we're on the bus, and they were just jabbering away about something. And Eddie looked back and said, "That's all you got, Gary? That's it? That's it? I don't hear anything." That was the only guy that I could ever hear that could get Gary to shut up because he could out-talk him. And I remember he got ticked in that locker room. And I think Ricky got ticked. And he was like, there, da-da-da-da-da-da. And when we're walking out of that locker room, I said, boy, Utah, you made the biggest mistake. If you would have just let us be up by 5, we could have self-imploded, But you put us down, and now we're all locked in together and ticked. And it was it was one of the bigger turnarounds I saw in one quarter, because I think we went out of that quarter up by 15 or 20, and we ended up blowing them out. And that was the influence, and then we ended up getting to the Western Conference Final. But it was something where that team could have easily not gotten there. And it was that senior leadership, or the veteran leadership, I should say, that really helped carry it. And it helped really create a good atmosphere on the team, because guys used to like to go with their Nintendos and play Madden football, on the road. And or they'd have contests, or they'd have miniature golf. And it'd be crazy what guys could do for $100. If guys are making billions or whatever, and if you get competitive on a stupid thing like that. But when the team's hanging together like that and doing things that are fun and building chemistry outside the court, that's a good sign that you can do good things on the court.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned that you guys made it to the conference finals. You played against the Phoenix Suns, and Charles Barkley actually won the MVP award that season.
Yeah.
You took them to a 7-game series.
Yes.
What do you think, what would have happened if you made it to the finals and you guys would have played against the Bulls?
Statistically, we would have lost. I should say, we would have got them. Da-da-da-da-da. We're still young and fragile. We were explosive and dangerous then, and it would have been interesting to see what that team could have done. I think the Bulls were really hitting on cylinders then, and our veterans didn't have enough experience yet, I think, to handle it. One of the things I remember even later on was we got to we were in the Western Conference Finals against Utah, and Detlef was just going off. He was scoring at will, whatever matchup he had, and we went away from him. And I went to Coach Stotts, because I could talk to the assistant coaches kind of freely, because they knew, like, hey, Steve's not arguing for playing time. He's actually just trying to help the team. And I'd be like, Coach, why did we just go away from Detlef? He's killing them. And he's like, we want to save them for the fourth quarter so they don't figure it out. And I sat back down the next time out. I came up and I said, Coach, they're going to figure it out at halftime anyway. And he is like, look, if certain people don't get their numbers, now mind you, this is in the Western Conference Finals. If certain people don't get their numbers, they will get their numbers. Do you want them screwing up the game in the first half or in the fourth quarter? And I sat back down and went, well, that kind of makes sense. But that's one of those tensions that you get when I talked about the NBA being the entertainment business, and there's nothing professional about that. I don't think that would have happened in Boston. I'm quite sure it wouldn't have. But when you have a young, more immature team, those things happen. So I think if that team would have went to the finals, if we would have got embarrassed like the first game, we could have maybe had that rally like we had against Utah. You know, where everybody gets really focused and says, hey, we got to get together and not get ourselves embarrassed, forget all the numbers. But it wasn't quite there yet. But maybe I'm wrong. Who knows?
Well, you still got your shot at the NBA Finals. In 1996, you guys made it to the finals and you played against the Chicago Bulls. And yeah, I remember I was a huge Chicago Bulls fan, and I remember that one scene where you get into the game and the crowd is just going nuts. And I had no idea if I missed something, but I've never seen something like that. What was that thing that they cheered you on the entire time? What was that a special thing?
There was a couple of things. Let me tell you one story about the Bulls or whatever, like the highlight, because like when you're deep in the bench, you get very few highlights. So this was one of the few. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the crowd, if that works for you. The highlight in that series was, I think we had lost the first two games, and it was game 3 or game 4. And it was going into halftime. And, you know, you're just sitting in the bench and you're waiting to go into the locker room and you're cheering on the team. And all of a sudden, coach says, Chef. You know, and this is a relatively close game. And you're like, what the heck is going on? But I'm like, all right, rip off my things and go up there. And he says, all right, I want you to back shadow the guard, go on in. So I go on in. And my job was, you know, I forget who the center was, but he was a big, stiff guy that, you know, shoots 15-footers, but he wasn't really athletic. So my job was to double team the point guard, get the ball thrown to him, and just take them out of their offense for the end of the set, right? And I'm like, okay, cool. Unfortunately, Phil Jackson substituted in Kukoc. And until a play starts, you can't sub back out. And I was looking around going, well, you got a point guard, you got Pippen, you got Jordan. These are not good matchups. And they're like, finally, take Kukoc, right? And I'm like, oh, great, this is not good. So sure enough, they isolate him on the top of the key. And Detlef's screaming at me like, don't let him go left, don't let him go left. And I'm like going, this is not a good place to be. And sure enough, he goes left. Detlef helps out, they kick the ball out, and then Kukoc goes down to the block, and they throw the ball into him. And I went, boy, you just made a mistake, because the only place a pig has fun is in the pig pen. And my job every day at practice is to go against a guy called Sean Kemp, and all I have to do is beat him up and don't hurt him. So the only place I could possibly guard you is down here on the block, and that's where you went. So I have my hand onto him, and I'm trying to muscle him a bit, and all of a sudden I hear a whistle. And I'm like, doggone it, I got a foul? I wasn't doing that much. And the referees were being nice. The internet doesn't lie. You can see this on YouTube, where they called him for traveling. So, you know, the buzzer rang, I got taken out of the game, but you can say, okay, for a guy that's never going to play or do much, in the best stage, in the NBA Finals, when the game's on the line and your team's actually down, for one play, you helped your team. And you're like, okay, that's a cool thing to, you know, put your hat on. So that was fun. Now, you know, you're like, hey, you got to celebrate these little things. You know, you know, it's not like, oh yeah, I was going to be an all-star until no. You know, oh, you're going, no. I mean, if any record I'd have is having non-guaranteed contracts for how many years relative to points scored. You're like, you know, teammates used to accuse me of stealing money, and I didn't really have a good comeback going, you know, you might be right, but hey, it's money, I'll take it, you know. I'm not going to complain too much about this. And that's the other thing that's funny, is you always talk about guys, because I had my 2 stints in the CBA, that'd be like, or growing up in college and in high school, oh, if I just had a chance in the NBA, I'd be so happy, da-da-da-da-da. No, I was not always the most talented guy on the end of the bench. Oftentimes I wasn't. But guys on the end of the bench would get their egos going. I'm in the NBA. I should be out there playing. I'm like, the coach already has 6 to 8 egos to deal with and problems to deal with. He doesn't want to deal with 11, 12, and 13 additional problems. Figure out a way to contribute. Shut up, be happy you're here, and contribute. Your life expectancy in the NBA increases significantly. So, back to the crowd cheering, right? And it was funny that there are actually some people that would dress up in chef's hats and coats and bring pots and pans into the game and then bang them together. So, and then Coach Carl, we have a really good team, right? So we're blowing teams out by 20 and 30. They'd have special rewards. You know, if we'd win by like 20 or more, we'd have a day off of practice. So that was a big thing to see if we could get the blowouts. And Coach would like to do this. The fans, you know, would want to relate to something, okay? So they watch Sean Kemp all day, right? And then they see this big, stiff guy come in. And they look and they say, I've got a better-looking jump shot than him, right? He's kind of muscular, and he tries real hard, and we feel bad for him. But I've had a few beers. The game's been on the line for a while, right? And look at this poor guy. Let's have some fun, because, you know, we're going to want to wait till the game's over anyway. So Coach would do this thing where he'd walk down to the end of the bench, kind of look at me, and then the people would actually be clapping. Chef, 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 right? And then he'd turn around, and he'd yo-yo the crowd, just play with them for a while, and then he'd finally say yes. And one of these times when he's yo-yoing, right, Michael Cage would look at me and go, look it, I've been busting my butt all game long, right? Sway, all you're doing is sitting here. And I was like, Mike, anytime you want to trade paychecks, I'm happy to do it with you. And he laughed at that. You know, he thought, that's pretty cool. You know, so then you'd get in, and sure enough, you'd try whatever you'd want. And, you know, if you hit a basket, the main thing when you're deep on the bench, you didn't want to end up with all zeros across the line. And here's another interesting fact. I'd confess this to Rich King, and he'd kind of confess it to me. If you started out practicing 2 or 3 hours, you know, before the game, actually it'd be 4 hours or more, and you'd play hard, right? You'd get a sweat, and you'd be stiff as a board sitting there. And sometimes you'd get into water drinking contests, which I should tell you about that. So you're sitting there, right? You're stiff as a board, and you would start slyly rooting for the other team. Because it's like, Rich, do you want to get in this game? No. You know, because it's like, they've been watching Sean dunk on everybody. There's nothing I can do outside of go out and embarrass myself, right? And I'm only going to be in there for 30 seconds, so is this really a good thing? I don't think so. So that would be one of those secrets, you know. And then you'd be like, oh, there's 5 minutes left in the game. How good a condition are you really in? You know, you're about to find out, because your adrenaline, I mean, I would get in there sometimes with 2 minutes left. I remember at the one free throw going, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, and my knees were still shaking. Going, Steve, the game's over with, you know, but you'd be so amped up. But then you'd also have situations where you'd get bored on the end of the bench, so you'd have things like Bill Cartwright. When we're in Tacoma, he would tell the guys on the end of the bench, one of you has to sneak in like a giant 4-piece Reese's Pieces, you know, candy bar. The 4-pack, you'd have to tuck it way in your sleeve and, in your sock and maybe tape it. And then at the end, you'd break it apart and everyone would share it. But you couldn't let this thing slip out during warm-ups at halftime. So you'd have to be really gentle going in for all your layups. No dunking or anything like that, right?
Wow.
Oh, yeah, and then you couldn't let anyone see. So I remember there's a story, I don't know if it's true, Spud Webb having a hot dog on the end of the bench. This I didn't see. This is just a rumor. But then so putting funny. Like the Gatorade cup and slowly act like he's drinking and push it from the back and eat it, you know. But we thought we were such the thieves by getting like the Reese's and no, you were a starter, you can't get this, right? But if you had a blowout, you better get that thing out of your sock before you go in the game, because that's a death penalty to you, you know, just like, what the heck are you thinking? But the other thing you would do, like some of them, Rich and the equipment manager, they would have the contest of who could name the song, the artist and the song title when the music would come on, and I'd be the judge. And then I would go with Bob Medina, and, you know, proper hydration is important. So we would have a contest, who could drink the most waters, okay? And since I've got a long torso, I was just downing these things. And in Old Key Arena, you would have to actually walk through the concierge area for like maybe 30 yards and then go through a tunnel to get back to the locker room. That would be locked up because there'd be no guards there. And I won the contest. I'm a winner. Yes. Oh, shoot. We are up by 25. And it is early in the fourth quarter. This is a bad thing because those goosebumps are about hitting my forearm. I think I can make it, but if I have to get in there, this is going to be really bad. Okay, Bob, we are still holding this lead. Maybe we're up to 30. There's no sense rooting for the other team. This is going to get ugly. Okay, Bob, I got to go. If anyone's missing me during this timeout, you let them know where I'm at, right? You cover for me. And he was like, yeah, we're in this game. You're good. So I take off running back, right? And I go to the public restroom. Nobody's out there in the concourse for, you know, there's a few people leaving early or whatever. So I go in there, you know, start taking a leak. The only other guy in there has had way too many beers. That's why he's missing the game. And he kind of takes this double look. He's like, wow, are you like this ravenous fan? Because your costume looks really good. And then he says like, hey, aren't you Scheffler? Something like that. It's like, yeah. He's like, hey, can I get your autograph? Like, after the game, I get done there, run back out there, and sure enough, get in the game. So this is the knucklehead stuff. I only did that once. Learn from that mistake. You know, you can't. I talk about joking around at the end of the bench. That's the part of it that keeps you going sometimes, but it's not the majority of what's happening. But yeah, crazy stuff like that could happen, and that would be one game where, if possible, you'd definitely be rooting for the other team, not to win, but just get it close enough, because I really don't want to get in right now.
Right. Steve, back to the NBA Finals in '96. You guys were putting up a great fight against the Bulls, and yeah, Gary was all over. Michael Kent was playing really well. But I remember Frank Brakowski had a hard time with Dennis Rodman. And I felt like in one game, he actually took your team out of the game. How do you feel about that?
Well, all right. So here's the thing. I would like to replay that series, okay? Now, going into the series, there's something called the plus-minus number that, you know, Seattle was pretty early on in adopting, and that's when you're in the game, how much do you influence the game positively? You know, how does the score differential happen compared to when you're out of the game? Nate McMillan had one of our highest positive-negative numbers on the team, imagine. Even though he wasn't a starter. When he was in, he influenced the game greatly, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so he was out with back things. He ended up getting Novocaine or whatever in his back, or cortisone, to try to make it through the finals, but he was really hobbled. And the games he played, I believe we blew him out, or were very competitive, and the games he missed, we got blown out by. That was one big hidden piece that was missing.
You're right. Yeah, true. I completely forgot about that. You're right.
Yeah, and the other big hidden piece was Gary was a serious calf injury that was slowing him down something fierce.
But he didn't mention it back then. He mentioned it many years later.
Right, and if you watch, but see, we're in the back, and, you're with the trainers and you know what's going on, and you're just like, wow, he is really hobbled. But I will give, Gary and I would have our run-ins or whatever, but Gary was one tough dude. When I think he broke his foot one time, and he was like, what do I have to do to play on this? And early in his career, he had a back problem. It was actually in his groin, but they found out it was in his back. And there was talk of him having career-ending surgery, trying to get this straightened out. And Frank Furtado was our trainer, and he was a very progressive trainer. And we had this special chair where you could actually change the curvature of the spine. You'd have these little pistons. I'm surprised it never caught on, but you just do these little minor exercises. And we had actually installed that on the plane for Gary, and we'd take it on the road, sometimes behind the bench or in the locker room they'd have that. And that was one of those interesting things. But, yeah, so Gary would be like, I'm not missing the game because of the broken foot. And I remember the one time we're in Portland, and he was getting, the instant... I forget what the liquid was, but when it hit your skin, it froze, and he was doing that on the shoulder. And he's like, sometimes when he's sleeping at night, you just wanted to take his gun and just shoot his arm off because it would be in so much pain. And he was able to go through incredible pain for that determination to win. So yeah, he was in the finals, but he was not full bore. And I think if you
still did a great job against Jordan.
Yeah. But just imagine if he's full go, and then you have Nate that's full go. Now, Coach Carl said, and this was one of the big things, and that's one of the reasons why they brought Burkowski in more, is because he's in a situation where Rodman gets 10 offensive rebounds. MVP of the game, And that was one of the things, hey, Frank will go against him and battle, head to head. And I've watched some of the film back then, right? And I do know this is one thing that goes on behind the scenes or whatever, is it's the entertainment business, right? So when it comes to entertainment, the referees are part of the entertainment. The NBA is not rigged, right? But it's not totally unbalanced. Because if you look at the halftime of when I was guarding Kukoc on the block, we were down 2 games. The referees are looking for opportunities to keep this series going, or to at least not make it a blowout. Okay? We get speeches at halftime going, okay, we're up 30 guys, right? The refs aren't going to try to help the other team win, but they're going to try to make the game more entertaining. So you're not going to get calls, right? Coach would say this in an abbreviated form, but you're going to get some bad calls called against you. Don't blow your heads and tick off that ref for the next game, right? Just take it like a man and play through it. And let's go get this victory. So, or you'd have things where it'd be like, okay, well, the worst was when Shaq was a rookie, right? We're playing him in Seattle, and he gets an early technical foul, and then second half, a second technical. He's DQ'd. He's out of the game. And we're like, yeah! Ding dong, the witch is dead. Clap your hands, get out of bed. We're like, hey, cool. Orlando without Shaq. This goes from a tight game to a decent victory. And the referees quick huddle together. And they're probably screaming, do you realize you just took Shaq out of the game? And they're like, oh, shoot, this is a bad thing, right? Because people pay to come, I paid all this money to bring my son to watch Shaq, and now he's out of the game. I'm bummed. I'm not a happy camper. So they all huddle together, and they come out, and they say, the first technical was not on Shaq, was on the Orlando bench. And we're just all rolling our eyes going, no, that was the worst. But you knew that, right? So, if I happen to be in the game with Sean because we're so depleted because of injuries, if there's a foul, I raise my hand going, I volunteer to take the foul. Don't give Sean the foul, right? Unless it's really blatant, the refs are like, well, yeah, he could have fouled him too. We'll give the foul to Scheffler because he's going to be out of the game. It's just part of the game, right? So.
Okay, but as a fan, you never hear those things. So this is actually the first time I hear something like that. That's crazy.
Well, sorry for. It's an entertainment business. There's nothing professional about professional athletics, and it's part of entertainment, right? So
you're telling me there's no Santa Claus right now?
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Wow.
Okay, so, I mean, and they'd also give you directives, right? Like there'd be times when they'd say, we are watching the spin move with the hook. That is a point of emphasis for us, right? So they try to communicate this to the players. Well, Sean Kemp's known for the spin move with a hook. That's like his go-to move. So they're kind of like, hey, you better back off that or you're going to get called for traveling, right? So there's that give and take. So do I think, like, how many times are you kicking a guy out of the team because of Rodman getting in a tangle with somebody? That doesn't really sound right, you know? So was there a special emphasis on Rodman and protecting him or different things like that? Because let me tell you, all right, judge this for yourself. Watch the tape what happens between Rodman and Bukowski, right? Now come back and say, if Jordan had done the same thing Bukowski had done to Payton, would they have thrown Jordan out of the game?
Of course not.
Okay, then
Good
you're
point.
saying, okay, so there is some, you know, so you're like, should they have thrown Brick out of the game because of that? All right, Rodman's playing head games and stuff. You know, it's part of the things, and yes, that was in the, we better watch out for any violence in the game. Because my whole thing was like, if there's a fight on the floor, there's like a $50,000 or $100,000 fine automatically from leaving the bench area. And this was a big quandary for me, going like, if there's a fight out there, my salary depends on what year. It might be $130,000 or it might be a grand total of $200,000, right? And you're like, I could lose almost my whole year of work by just going out there on the court. But if I don't go out there on the court, then you're a loser to your whole team, right? Everyone's rushing the court. You got to rush with them. What the heck do you do? I got the solution. I'm going to tackle Sean Kemp on the bench to keep him. So I will tackle him. I don't care if I get in a fight with him right there. If I get my lights punched out by Sean, that's fine because I can't hurt him. But at least I save him for the next game. I'm not on the court, so if everyone runs out there, I'll be a starter. And I still won't be a chump because I saved our team to get Sean in the next game. That was my only solution. So how does this relate to Bukowski and to Dennis Rodman? They were hypersensitive about we don't want another Detroit Pistons scene. You know, that was later on, like when Ortiz runs up into the stands, right?
Yes.
We want to make sure this is a very clean product, and we don't want Brick ending up getting in a fight with Rodman or anything like that. So that was kind of that tension there where I think they were hypersensitive, and that definitely hurt us. Because Brick, yeah, you might be playing some mind games with him, but he can play some mind games with Rodman too. And he wasn't afraid to go to war and to battle.
I think Bukowski was actually a good player. I mean, before he played for the Sonics, he was actually a good scorer too. He had a good career. Yeah,
and he was a good practical joker too. Because, well, getting back to Brick, I remember the one time we're playing Phoenix. Brick was screaming at the top of his lungs, illegal defense, ref. And I was like, Brick, we're on defense. Oh yeah,
No
flashbacks.
No way.
I was cracking up. And then another time, we go to Houston, and I think this might have been in the Western Conference Finals. And it was a situation where I was Mr. Cheap, right? I was like, I never know when I'm going out of this league. So here I am, and finally, they're always like, when I was on injured reserve, I'd be in like a business suit, and they're like, what do you want to do, be a banker? And I'm like, well, if I got to wear a suit, I could be out of this league tomorrow. At least I want to be able to wear this somewhere. Or so they're like, just get some new clothes. And I was like, fine. So I went with Eric Snow, and I got 2 pair of pants and 2 shirts, I think, right? That was my big, whopping spending spree for fashion, right? And we get into the locker room, I'm out early. So then the bus comes with the main players, right? The guys that are deep in the bench, they'll go on an early bus, and they'll get in there. And by the way, if you ever want to get into an NBA game, this was before 9/11, so security might have tightened up. But if you just walked in there being a large fellow or even looking like an assistant coach, you could get right into the locker room and nobody gave you much who. Just act like you know what you're doing. And I can tell you, remind me, there's one time I did get stopped. But look, I'm getting so diverted in all these stories. So anyways, where was I?
Oh, man, continue. Love it.
Okay, so Brokowski goes, right, when the bus comes, and he gets his little scissors out, and he cuts the whole seam down the back of the pants. But he cuts it in such a way that the threads are still there, so they're still held together. So after the game, fortunately, we won, and I'm walking out. And Brick, could you get that bag for me, or could you get something right? Could you throw me a Gatorade like out of the cooler? So I bend down to throw him a Gatorade, and my whole pants split out. And now I'm livid. I'm like, see this stupid fashion stuff? I knew I should have just stuck with jeans and go for this fashion stuff. Right? I go off, and I'm like, oh, we won, but this is stupid. So now I got to get a stupid towel, wrap it around my waist, and go out to the bus or something, right? I'm like, this is such an idiot. Why did I ever let these morons talk me into getting fashion, Should have just stuck with my blue-collar stuff. So then I'm sitting on the bench, I'm sitting on the bus, and our equipment manager, Mark St. Ives, comes up to me and says, Steve, there might be something to that. Then he lets me know that, yeah, Brick was the one that just cut my pants. So we had a good chuckle out. Oh, yeah. It was something where you could just go to a tailor and they could just restitch it because it was on the seam, right? You just cut the threads so they held together when I put them on. But once I bent down to get the Gatorade, it wasn't a little open. It just... So, but to give you an idea how cheap I was, when I was at Charlotte, I still drove my car from high school, was a Volkswagen Diesel Rabbit. And the alternator had problems, so a diesel car, once you get it started, it'll keep running even if the alternator goes because you don't have spark plugs. So I would sometimes have bungee cords holding the alternator because it kept on shearing the bolts that were supposed to go in there, and at times I'd have an emergency screwdriver that would throw in where the bolts were supposed to go just to keep the alternator running. But, so, I finally figured out after my rookie year that the cost of the car was about equal to the fine I would get for being late, so I said this is no longer a good financial decision. But I would always drive to practice in the games in this Volkswagen Diesel Rabbit. And the guys would just be shaking their head. And I remember Armin Gilliam was like, you need a safe car, you need a Mercedes. He was like, you're making us look bad. He didn't say that, but that was, this is an embarrassment. And
but you know what? Actually, that proves that you don't have to worry about, or nobody needs to worry about you, because if you get cut from the NBA, we know you'll be all right because you have a perfect understanding on how to not spend too much money.
Trying not to, yes. But so then the newspaper, right, or the TV station does an article on just NBA players' cars, right, for the Charlotte Hornets. And which car gets featured?
Oh, no.
The guys are just like, I got a custom Ferrari with this and this, and they got this stupid. Well, it was the one that was out of the norm, so I got a big chuckle out of that. But then, talk about trying to sneak into the arena. They rotated one day at Charlotte. This is how low you are on the totem pole. This is how you stay hungry in the NBA, because you know your butt can get cut at any time. Remember back to one of those earlier questions? I go in there, you know, and I'm coming in early with my bag or whatever, and the security guard goes, "Do you have a security pass?" I was like, "No, I'm on the team." I was like, "No, I'm sorry, you can't get in without a security pass." I'm like, they never gave players security passes, right?
Oh, gosh.
So I'm trying to get into the locker room to get dressed to go work out before the game, and the security guard's like, "Nope, ain't falling for that, buddy. I'm not a visitor. I'm on the home team." You're not Rex Chapman. You're not Muggsy Bogues. You're not J.R. Reed. I don't know who you are. You're just some crazy fan trying to.
Well, you could have passed for Kelly Tripucka.
What? Yeah,
you could have
Tripucka.
passed for Kelly Tripucka. Kelly Tripucka.
Yes, he was on that team also. So eventually, we had to get like the trainer or the equipment manager to come down and say, "No, he's legit. He can come in." So, yeah, life at the end of the bench isn't quite as glamorous as the commercials make it out to be.
That's pretty interesting. I actually believe I was always really interested in listening to players that played on the Bulls in the mid-'90s.
Okay.
And most of the role players said that Phil Jackson always made them feel important to the team. And I also believe that even the 12th or the 13th or the 14th guy on the roster has an important role. Even if it's a small role, but it's still important for the team.
Yeah.
So I think your role was also important in order to beat Sean Kemp up at practice.
Yeah,
No, that's just how I feel. I mean, I'm a basketball coach too, and I try to tell my players everybody on a team has a role, and it takes a lot of maturity and understanding to accept the role, even though it's a small one. But at the end, it's still important.
Okay, so let me tell you, I will brag now, right? Here's my role. We're playing Orlando after a few years when Shaq's no longer a rookie. And I played summer league at Orlando, so they kind of knew my character, right? And my character, I did not throw cheap elbows, right? I did not do anything that you would consider dirty, right? Would I grab and hold a guy, try to get an advantage? Absolutely. But I was kind of a football player in a basketball player's uniform, right? And they knew this, right? And, like I remember one time we were playing Charlotte before the game, Brick and I were playing one-on-one, and I broke his nose. He had a very good game that day. But they were like, watch out for Chef. When I'd come in as a rookie for Charlotte, they would play the song Wild Thing, which was pretty accurate, right?
Nice.
Okay, so here I am, and Shaq's got 48, and there's a minute and a half left. And they put Shaq back in the game because Orlando's blowing us out. And they put him into the game to get 50. Coach Carl gets ticked, and he said, "Chef, get in there," because people recognize the name Shaq, Michael Jordan, all this good stuff. So they're like, "Hey, do you have any Michael Jordan stories?" Which I do have one. "And do they have any Shaq stories?" And I'm like, "All right, here's my Shaq story." I go in the game, right? The guy's shooting a free throw. He shoots one. The horn blows. Shaq comes back out of the game. Coach Hill looked and said, "Do I really want to risk the future of the Orlando Magic for Shaq to get 50 with a monster like that?" Now, I know he's a harmless teddy bear, right? But he is uncoordinated enough and just stupid enough that by accident he could ruin his career. "This is not good, Shaq. I am saving you." And I'm like, "Cool, I got Shaq out of the game. Did nothing, just stood there on the free throw line. On the side or whatever." And I was like, okay, for a guy deep in the bench. Another time, we're playing my rookie year against the Bulls, right? And we're getting blown out. It was so bad they put us in the third quarter. And I was really like going, oh boy, I'm going to be sucking some serious lung this game, right? And the Bulls, they clear out their bench too, and they put us in. And we're all riled up going, oh, we got to play! We're sitting here for too long! Every day I sit here. I was so bad at Charlotte the one time, we were down to 6 players only available, right? Because when we were playing Seattle the one time, and I didn't get in the game. That's when you know your career in the NBA could be very short. Now you know why I think I was so fortunate, okay? So, but hey, we're getting blown out, so I get in the game. And sure enough, we're rowdy enough and have fun enough, we start bringing it back. So the Bulls have to put back in their starters. Oh. And you know, Coach Little's sitting there then going like, well, do I put my starters back in? But they've been getting their butts kicked, or do I let these rowdy guys keep going? And he let us go for a while, right? So this is why we were getting kicked by 30, is because Jordan was on some pick, and I got isolated by him in the corner, right? One-on-one. And as soon as he caught the ball and saw me, he just tucked it, and he waved everybody away. And I was like, this is not good, right? This is how you end up on the wrong side of the poster, rookie. You don't want to be that guy, okay? So you can tell by my voice, if we're on Skype, I could give you some visuals, right? I'm like, this is a bad thing, right? And I'm already really amped up because you're playing the Bulls, you're in the game, this is Jordan, and you're isolated one-on-one. So I am jumping around like I forget what, the Mexican jumping beans or whatever, right? I'm just spastic out there. And I've got enough adrenaline running that I'm probably beat red. And Jordan's looking at me going, I'm pretty sure I can get around this guy. Actually, I'm positive I can get around this guy. I could dunk really good. But there is a chance. You know, that idiot could actually hurt me. So he took 1 or 2 dribbles, and he stepped back and took a jump shot, and I jumped up, and he missed it. So I can say, you know, I shut down Shaq, and I shut down Jordan, and wait, I creamed Larry Bird one-on-one. So yeah, I should have been the All-Star. I should have, you know, it was all rigged against me that I didn't get my chance. It was coach's fault. The refs were against me, the coaches were against me. There you go, now my Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde comes out. But, you know, end of the bench, you got to keep yourself entertained.
Oh, man. Steve, it was great to have you on the show, man. It was a pleasure to get so many stories, man. It was awesome.
Sorry for running out all your tape.
No, man, it's all good.